Good to see everybody here, and glad for the ones that's joined us online. It's Mother's Day, and so today we give thanks for our moms, and there's moms everywhere. And so, boy, I'm telling you, if you have watched moms and pay attention to it from time to time, you start noticing, especially as a husband and a dad, how much work they do. And I work a lot, yes, but I get tired in the evening, and I'll sit down and I'll notice moms keep going. It seems like, and they can go longer than a whole lot of other people can. So they deserve a lot of credit and appreciation, and so we want to express that to them today and thank them for all that they do. Okay, we're continuing in our study in the book of Genesis, and we're moving right along. We're down to just a few weeks left in this study, and there's a lot of material to cover. So I'm going to ask you to read ahead at home so you can get, because there's about 10 chapters left, and we only got a couple of weeks. So there'll be a lot of things that if we're not careful, we're going to miss. So you got homework, everybody here and those listening, to read these last 10 chapters so you stay with the story, because we've studied so much in 40 chapters from the creation of earth, and we've gone all the way through the flood. We've gone through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now we're out to one of his sons. And I think it's kind of fitting that Genesis ends, even though the book is called The Beginning, Genesis ends with this story of Joseph, because Joseph kind of wraps up the story of these patriarchs of the Israelite nation. And if you wanted to condense it, I mean, we can read the rest of the Bible, yes, but in a nutshell, book of Genesis is a miniature version of the whole Bible. And what I say that's because I hope, as we've noticed the last week or two, and especially through these next few weeks, how much Joseph is paralleled with Jesus. He's sort of a picture of Jesus. And we'll point out some of those things near the end of our lesson. But notice how the Bible itself, the story of it, it's got this history, and people need God, and they realize their failures, and God has given them commands and things to obey, and they sometimes follow them and sometimes break them, and they realize they need help, and then this story just progresses through to a time when they are in trouble and they need somebody to help, and that's who Joseph becomes, that person that helps out. And so we'll notice that as we finish up the book of Genesis, but just kind of keep that in mind, how much Joseph is like a picture of Jesus in a lot of ways. So just to pick up where we were last week, if you remember our study from last week, we were in chapter 38 and 39, and where Joseph is serving in Potiphar's house, and Potiphar's wife makes advances towards him, and he rejects her, and then she performs this little plot to get him arrested, and he's thrown into prison. And so now, when we left last week's lesson, here Joseph is. He has been up and down and up and down and up and down. He was the favored son with the coat of many colors, didn't have to do the work like the other brothers did. Then they throw him into slavery and winds up in a pit. Then they sell him off, and now he's an Egyptian slave. And next thing you know, he's in Potiphar's house, and he's climbed the ladder again. And the one thing that rides through that entire section that we studied is this same phrase, and we see it again here. And let's start in chapter 39. I know that's not on the text that you're working with today in your book, but chapter 39, and go to about verse 20. And that's where I'm going to pick up, because it says last week that he was thrown into prison, and where the king's prisoners were confined, Joseph was there in prison. So he's been in a pit, he's been out of the pit, he's been an Egyptian slave, now he's in Potiphar's house, and now he's back in a prison. In verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph. And that theme runs through the entire story of Joseph that we read, that the Lord was with him. This is about the 5th or 6th time it's already stated this phrase, the Lord was with Joseph. And Joseph obviously was with the Lord, because he doesn't give up on God, and we see that through his story. It said, and he extended kindness to him, this is still verse 21, he granted him favor with the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority, and he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him. There it is again. And the Lord made everything that he did successful. Joseph has God's hand on him, and Joseph recognizes that. Now, going back and studying this week, I learned that when you were in an Egyptian prison, you were chained and shackled to a stone pillar. There was no roaming around the place. You were tied to it like a dog on a chain out in a yard. I mean, you were a prisoner. You had very little freedoms. If you were let loose, it was to go work, slave work, and you come back and you were shackled again. And this is the way Joseph started in this prison. But we can see right away that the warden put the prisoners under Joseph's authority. Now, what's that mean? It doesn't mean he was the boss. It means now he doesn't have shackles and chains on him, but he's serving all the prisoners. So we're made to believe that he's being promoted and promoted and promoted. He's still a prisoner. And now instead of being chained to the wall, he's serving everybody. He's tending to all the other prisoners. So yes, he's not chained up, but he's still a slave. All right, but it says that everything that Joseph did, the Lord made successful in verse 23. All right, so verse 1 of chapter 40 is where we begin to read about these dreams. Do you remember Joseph had dreams? Way back when he was a young fella, he had those dreams about how he was going to be the highest, the sheaf of wheat, and how the other ones were going to bow down to him, those dreams, and he told those dreams to his brothers and his dad. All right, so he's going to interpret some dreams here. So after this, the king of Egypt's cupbearer and the baker offended their master, and the king of Egypt, Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guards in the prison where Joseph was confined. So the king would have a cupbearer. Everybody know what the cupbearer was? He was the one that drank from the king's cup first, because if 30 seconds later he didn't fall over dead, it was safe for the king to drink. But you don't want that job. And so, but anyway, the cupbearer and the chief baker were thrown into this very same prison where Joseph was. So it says, they put him in the custody of the house of the captain of the guards in the prison where Joseph was confined. Verse 4, the captain of the guards assigned Joseph to them as their personal attendant, and they were in custody for some time. The kings of Egypt's cupbearer and the baker, who were confined in prison, each had a dream. So they both have a dream, and they tell Joseph about their dream. And we won't read all of that, but I'll just tell you what they were about. They had to do with their future. Both of them had a dream about three things, and then after the three things that they saw, something happened to the things. One of them had to do with a vine, and the other one had to do with wheat, I think it was. Anyway, a basket of white bread, sorry. And so he tells the cupbearer, he says, look, you've had these dreams, tell me about them. And so they both do. And he says, doesn't God still, isn't he still able to interpret dreams? So this tells us right away that even though Joseph's in prison, he hasn't given up on God. He's referencing God by saying, there's God who can interpret these dreams. Verse 8 is, we had dreams, they said to him, but there is no one to interpret the dreams. And Joseph said to them, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. This means that Joseph is still following his God. Imagine him, he's in prison now, and he's thinking, I didn't do anything wrong, and here I am again in this prison. And I'm tired of being knocked down, but he doesn't give up. He still stays true to God. So he tells them the dreams, and he says to the cupbearer, in 3 days, you're going to be promoted back to your position again. Pharaoh is going to put you back into place so he had you before. And he tells the baker, he says, oh yeah, here's your dream, and your dream means after 3 days, you're going to die. Now you imagine getting that news. Well, what he says is going to happen is exactly what happens. Let's go to verse 20. On the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he gave a feast for all his servants. He elevated the chief cupbearer and the chief baker among his servants. Pharaoh restored the chief cupbaker to his position as cupbearer, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But Pharaoh hanged the chief baker just as Joseph had explained to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Now, why is that verse key? If you go back in earlier in that section, when Joseph says, I'm going to tell you what these dreams are, he says, but when you go to Pharaoh, please remember me. Let's go back to verse 14. But when all goes well for you, remember that I was with you. Please show kindness to me by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing that they should put me in the dungeon. And then we just read that when he got back to his spot as the cupbearer, it says he forgot about him. 3 days, that's all it took. He just forgot about him. And so, did he really forget about him? Was he just so happy to be there? Or was there something else going on here? Because Joseph's in his prison and he wants to get out. But it's obviously not time. And so this kind of shows us that the timing was not right yet for Joseph to come out of this prison. Why would God leave him there any longer? And I think it's because that Joseph still had to grow some more. Do you remember how we've watched Abraham and Isaac and Jacob all have to wait? That Abraham and Sarah had to wait, and Jacob had to wait, and Isaac had to wait, and it made those guys stronger, because when we have to wait in a tough spot until the time is just right, God's not punishing us, he's building us up. He's making us stronger, and we're going through something that's really difficult, and we're thinking, I'm had enough of this. I'm ready to get out of here. I don't think I've done anything bad enough to deserve this situation that I'm in, but I just want to be free from this. But God is working on us in a way to make us grow. I was reading one thing this week, and it said about this lady that was a singer. She was a professional opera singer, and she sang. She had the privilege to sing in front of this famous composer. This was in like the 1700s, and I can't remember his name. She sang in front of this famous composer. This is in Germany, I think. And after she finished, it was fantastic. And she was young, and they said, what do you think? She said, she's really good. She'll be great after her heart's broken. And he said, what do you mean? He said, this girl is so young, she hasn't been through enough trials or troubles so that she can sing great. He said, but the emotion's not there yet. I can't see the love in her voice yet. It'll be there, but she's got to go through something tough. She's got to have her heart broken first, and then she'll be great. And so that story kind of translates over to this. Joseph is being made into something that God's going to need him for later. Now, how much later? Verse 1 of chapter 41. At the end of 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream. So after this whole thing's happened on Pharaoh's birthday, 2 more years goes by. And that cupbearer didn't remember him one day, then the 2 years, or speak his name. Joseph's stuck in this prison still for 2 more years. Now, a day's long, a week's long, a month's kind of long. 2 years is long to be in a prison. He's already been there a while. And he's still stuck in here. And every day, he is still having to stay true and believe that God is his God. And you can see how he would feel like, what is going on here? I couldn't help but think about Daniel, who was in a prison. He was sent off as a teenager, and we've kind of talked about how he and Joseph parallel a little bit. But how he's in that den with all those lions, and I've always kind of wondered, what did he do that night? Did he pray all night long? I would have, for sure. But did he pray? But he had gone through all that time constantly praying to God, even though they told him he couldn't, and he did it anyway. And here Joseph is obviously doing the same thing. It doesn't say anything about while he was in that prison that other people were praying to God or anything else. And he's the only one that has been promoted in all this. So we can see that the providence that he's got and the success that God's given him just for being faithful to him. So 2 years goes by, and here's Pharaoh, and he has a dream. And so you probably learned this before when you were younger, but let's go through this. Verse 1, at the end of 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing beside the Nile when 7 healthy-looking, well-fed cows came up from the Nile and began to graze among the reeds. And after them, 7 other cows, sickly and thin, came up from the Nile and stood beside those cows along the bank of the Nile. The sickly, thin cows ate the healthy, well-fed cows. And then Pharaoh woke up. So he's had this dream about these big, fat cows that are grazing, and all of a sudden, these thin, skinny cows come up and eat those healthy cows. But it says they eat the well-fed cows. He wakes up. He falls back asleep, and it says he's dreamed a second time. 7 heads of grain, plump and good, came up on one stalk, and after them 7 heads of grain, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up, and the thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 plump full ones. And then Pharaoh woke up, and he realizes it was only a dream. All right, so he's had 2 dreams about something that's very healthy being consumed by something that's not so healthy. In fact, it's pitiful. So verse 8, when morning came, he was troubled. So he summoned all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men, and Pharaoh told him his dreams. Watch, but no one could interpret them for him. Now, when it says summoned the magicians and all the wise men, this is not just a couple of guys. These were trained scholars. They knew all the mythologies. They knew all the astrology stuff. They had all these. They knew a lot about the underworld, and they could decipher and investigate and give their interpretations and all these things. But when it came to this, they were in over their head. It said no one could interpret it. Nobody. So he looked through all his smart guys, and nobody could interpret what he needed to hear. So verse 9, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I remember my faults. So 2 years has gone by, and once Pharaoh's had this dream, and he goes, I can't figure out what this is about. Then all of a sudden, this guy goes, oh yeah, Joseph. Now, we could say coincidence. We could say suddenly he remembers something. I don't believe that. I believe that on this day, it was the right time. Now it was the right time. So what's been going on that whole time is that we said God was preparing Joseph, but God was also making things in his plan to fit at just the right time. And that's one thing I seem to keep coming back to on this lesson is everybody that's in here today or watching or will watch it later or has ever studied this, everybody has gone through something in their life where they say, when is so-and-so going to happen? I'm tired of waiting. I don't want to be in this part anymore. And they don't know when the time is going to be right, and there's a time where it is perfect, but only God knows it. And we just have to say, okay, we trust you and we have faith in you, and it looks like Joseph did that. Because watch what happens. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, today I remember my faults. Pharaoh was angry with his servants, and he put me and the chief baker into custody of the captain of the guards. He and I had dreams on the same night. Each dream had its own meaning. Now a young Hebrew, a slave of the captain of the guards, was with us there. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted our dreams for us. And each had its own interpretation. It turned out just the way he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was hanged. And he said, that guy that was in the prison with us, he told us what our dreams were, and it worked out exactly the way he said. So verse 14, then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and they quickly brought him from the dungeon. He shaved, changed his clothes, and went to Pharaoh. This shave changed his clothes. He's in a dungeon, right? He's a slave. Not looking too good. He's been in the mud and the muck and the dripping leaks everywhere and dirty, and he had a bath. He's been working every day. He's a dirty fella. He needs cleaning up for one thing. He's going to go before Pharaoh. They say, you can clean up. He said, okay, he's going to clean up. But the shaving part, when I was studying, Egyptians shaved their heads. They did not believe in all this hair, facial hair. But Hebrews did. They had beards. You've seen pictures where most of them got beards and everything. But the Egyptians, you've seen a lot of pictures in history books, I guess, or a lot of them, they would shave their head. And part of the reason they believe that is because they believed they needed to look their very best for the afterlife where they'd die at any moment. So they kept themselves shaved. So anyway, part of this, it doesn't say he shaved his head, but it says he shaved, he's cleaned himself up, and he's carried to Pharaoh. And it says in verse 15, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and no one can interpret it, but I have heard it said about you that you can hear a dream and interpret it. Now, before we read any further, I want you to listen to this one thought. Joseph is being carried before Pharaoh. He's got every opportunity right here when Pharaoh says, I hear that you can do this, to say, I sure can, because that's his free ticket out of this prison. That is not what he says. I am not able to, Joseph answered. It is God who will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. And we have our full proof that this whole 2-year period, Joseph has been praying to his God and saying, whenever it's time, I'm ready. Whenever you'll get me out of here, I'm ready. And whenever you decide, that's fine with me. I'm just going to keep having faith in you, because I believe he still believed in those dreams he had way when he was a little boy. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, in my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile when 7 well-fed healthy cows came up from the Nile and grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, weak, very sickly and thin, came up. I've never seen such sickly ones as these in all the land of Egypt. Then the thin, sickly cows ate the first 7 well-fed cows, and when they had devoured them, you could not tell that they had devoured them. Their appearance was as bad as it had been before. So he says the cows ate the fat cows, and they looked just as bad as they did before. He says, then I woke up, and in my dream I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, coming up on one stalk. After them 7 heads of grain, withered and thin, and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. The thin heads of grain swallowed the 7 good ones. I told this to the magicians, but no one can tell me what it means. I got nobody. Do you know how? And Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. Joseph doesn't take any credit. He says, God has revealed what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams mean the same thing. The 7 thin, sickly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 worthless, scorched heads of grain are 7 years of famine. So he's telling him these first 7 years are going to be full of abundance, fruitful crops. You're going to have so much food you can't stand it. But the next 7 years, there's going to be a massive famine in the land, and you've got a problem. There's going to be no food. And in verse 28, it is just as I told Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt. After them, 7 years of famine will take place, and all the abundance in the land of Egypt will be forgotten. The famine will devastate the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because of the famine that follows it, for the famine will be very severe. Since the dream was given twice to Pharaoh, it means that the matter has been determined by God, and he will carry it out soon. So what Joseph is saying is, look, you didn't dream this one time. You dreamed this 2 times in 2 different ways. God is clearly telling you what's about to happen. And we've had that and probably happened in our lives before. Have you ever just been thumped and thumped and thumped by God, and you're like, oh, okay, I get it now. I mean, I've had times where you talk to your kids, and you just you call their name and call their name and call their name, and they don't seem to listen. You have to finally have to say, look at my face. Are you hearing what I'm saying? And what God has done is given Pharaoh 2 dreams that mean the same thing, and Joseph is saying, look, this is going to happen. He's told you twice. But I just keep noticing Joseph doesn't take any credit. He constantly is telling Pharaoh, God is the one that's telling you this. But here's the trick with this whole thing. These magicians and wise guys he's had that would interpret things, they might get some of that right some of the time. We don't ever have any indication that they had any advice for the problems. But Joseph seems to have that. Watch verse 33. So now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the harvest of the land in Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Let him gather all the excess food during these good years that are coming. Under Pharaoh's authority, store the grain in the cities so they may preserve it as food. And the food will be reserved for the land during the 7 years of famine that will take place in the land of Egypt. Then the country will not be wiped out by the famine. So Joseph's saying, look, you got a problem, and the only way you're going to fix this is you need to save up for that day when you don't have any food. And you need a plan here. You need a plan of action. You need overseers. You need a crop saving here. You need a place to put it. You need a place to store it. You need to pull from some now so that you've got it for later. And that way everybody will survive. And he gives him this big plan. Nobody else is even able to do it. I imagine all these wise guys that's in there got their chins on the floor by now. How is he coming up with all this stuff? But verse 37, the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all the servants. It doesn't say anything about anybody looking down and they're in awe. And I like what he says next. And he said to them, can we find anyone like this, a man who has God's Spirit in him? This is Pharaoh. He's a pagan. This guy doesn't worship God, but he's acknowledging God, and he is acknowledging Joseph has God with him. And I don't know if he heard the story from old Potiphar about everything that Potiphar had was just growing like crazy and so successful, but he notices this. And so he says, since God made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning and wise as you are. You will be over my house, and all my people will obey your commands. And this just goes on as Pharaoh puts him in a place where he is right behind Pharaoh. So he's gone from a prison, chained up, to second in command in just that little bit of time, because the time was absolutely right. Now, one person I was listening to this week, the sermon he was given was on what to do with success. How do people react? And it's not a part of the lesson that we were going to work with today, but it is a piece of what this story is about. Because Joseph, we've noticed, was knocked down to the bottom. And after faith and trusting and patience and learning to wait, he was pulled to the top. He was exalted. In fact, that in my Bible, in the middle of that section we just read, the sub heading at verse 37 is Joseph's exalted. Okay? And here he's put in his place with a lot of power, but he does not forget about God. And just a life lesson for me that I try to teach to my kids and anybody else that I see, that I'm youth that I'm working with, whether it's coaching or working with or whatever, is say, don't ever forget about the time when you were in the valley and who carried you through it. Because when you get up on the mountain, you're going to feel like you don't need him anymore. I feel like that's where our country is right now. They will feel like, hey, we're doing it on our own. Look how successful we are. We got jobs, money flowing everywhere. Everybody's got a phone, nice cars, houses. Boom, look at this. There's just stuff just prospering like crazy. We don't need God, and that's exactly what's happened. The world has kicked God to the corner. And if they get in a trouble spot, then when we pray the most, when we're in trouble. Dear God, help me through this. Dear God, get me out of this. Dear God, I need help. But Joseph is put in this place of power, and he does not forget about God. And I've got proof for it. It says in verse 46, or verse 45, Pharaoh gave Joseph the name. He took it. He gave him a wife. He took the wife. He went throughout the land of Egypt. Verse 46, Joseph was 36 years old. He entered the service of Pharaoh. Go on down, and he has some sons. Verse 51, he named the first one Manasseh. Look what his name means. God has made me forget all my hardships and my whole family. And he has a second son, named him Ephraim. God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. He says, in everything I've been through, God has brought me to the top, and I'm not going to forget about it. And if you go over in Deuteronomy chapter 8, there's a place where there's a warning to the people. When you are successful and you're in the land of milk and honey, don't forget who gave you the water out of the rock. Don't forget who fed you the manna when you were about to starve. Don't become proud, and don't forget about who put you in that place and who got you out of that place. I think part of the reason that the people were in Egypt for 430 years in slavery was so that they would realize generation after generation after generation, when we ever get out of this, we're never, ever going to forget about God. The Passover still happens, right? That's a celebration that has been taking place since the day they were going to leave Egypt. They did that has something that shows they have not forgotten about what God did. All right, so here as we kind of wrap up this section anyway, remember at the beginning we said how Joseph was a picture of what Jesus is, his life is. And I started writing them down, and I ran out of spaces to put them. I said, I'm just going to say them. But think about how, Joseph had a special coat, and Jesus Christ was a special. It says, here he comes, walking along. And then John the Baptist knows, look, the Lamb of God. And Joseph's special. And the next thing you know, he's in a pit. And Jesus, when he's going out with his disciples, he goes to his hometown. He said, my people don't even want me here. And then Joseph goes on, and he is up, down, up, down, up, down. He suffers and suffers and suffers. He has to wait and wait and wait. Jesus was 30 years old before he ever comes out, and it's the time to go teach people and preach to people. And then time goes by, and you remember how we read in the book of John, when he's talking to his disciples and says, my hour has not yet come. My hour has not yet come. It keeps saying that. But the time is not right. My hour is not here. Isn't that so similar to what we're seeing here? Everything with Joseph had a time. And everything was on a timetable that God had in a plan. And here Joseph is on the right time. Bam, there it is. And just like with Jesus, when the right time came, when the hour is here, now it's time. And what did Joseph do? He went to save the people by just having this plan that God gave him to provide food, the nourishment that people need so they wouldn't starve to death. And here Jesus is the same thing. He is the one that's going to save the people by just being the one who would give of himself, who would sacrifice of himself. And he'd be the one to save everybody. Now flip over to... Okay, go to verse 53. We're still in that same chapter, 41. Then the 7 years of abundance in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine everywhere, in every land, but the whole land of Egypt there was food. When the whole land of Egypt was stricken with famine, the people cried out to Pharaoh for food, and Pharaoh said, go see Joseph. He says, go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you. And what's the Bible teach us in all the New Testament? When you're starving and when you need saving, go to Jesus. And he's the one that can save you. Joseph was the only one that had the food and could give it out. And Jesus is the only one who's got the salvation and can give it out. God declared it that way. Both guys, they're so parallel in so many ways. And had Joseph not had that same character we see from beginning to end, it wouldn't parallel. But Joseph kept his humility all the way through it. Okay? And then what did it say a few minutes ago? He was exalted. And if you go over in the New Testament, you read where Jesus is exalted. When he's exalted, Peter and Paul talk about how he'll be exalted and how when we go to heaven, he's sitting on the throne. He's been exalted. He's been put in that position of high power. So just notice all those parallels between Joseph and Jesus. And this is not the end of this story. Joseph's going to have something else that we haven't even talked about. He's got compassion for the people, including his own family, who he should have a bunch of revenge for. But he follows God, and he has a compassionate heart, and he has a heart like Jesus has. And so as we go to finish up the story, we see this compassion come out. I mean, we don't even see so much of the backstory of his life, but we see so much of what we need to see. And it's the dedication he has to saying, okay, God, you gave me this plan a long time ago, and I don't know how this is going to work out, but whenever it does, it's going to be good. And so he waits and waits, and now he's promoted. And so we stop there for today. But in verse 57 of that chapter 41, every land came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, for the famine was severe in every land. And that's where we pick up next week. There's a famine. We're still in the famine. And so there's the food that's stored up, and Joseph's the one in charge. So what's going to happen next? And that's where we go in next week's lesson. Questions, comments you had, any thoughts? Anybody? A lot of information.
I really think God had to be, he always was running the show, but it's kind of obvious he's running the show because what are the chances really that Pharaoh's going to somehow call this guy who's been in prison, going to hear what he has to say about the dream and just like
Mm.
I mean, for me, you don't want to listen to somebody like that.
Mm.
You don't think they have any, they're a prisoner. But God had it set up so he would be receptive to what
Yeah.
the person had to say, and his advisors all receptive, and that had to be God working in that
Yeah.
situation, because I can't see somebody just some stranger off the street comes and says, "This is what's going to happen." Like, sure, yeah, that's
Mm-hmm.
really what's going to happen. Like,
Yeah.
he was right in, and I mean that's pretty amazing that God
Yeah.
had
That
this plan.
this story in particular, like you were saying, it shows how God's in control. But that whole, I mean, the whole book of Genesis is it's just constant. God's in control of all of it, whether you like it or not. And one thing I noticed too, I didn't mention, is when people that reject God in every way possible, get them in a bind where there's nobody left. Then they'll say, okay, maybe I'll listen to this God guy. Maybe he's got something to him. That's what Pharaoh had to do. He didn't worship God a lick. But when there was nobody else to answer his question, he didn't have no choice. He says, okay, fine, we'll listen, we'll see what God has to say about it.
Amazing to see God will actually still at that point
Mm-hmm.
answer.
Yep. All right, let's have prayer. Mark, you pray for us.
Heavenly Father, I thank you for loving us to get us back here in your house another week. Lord, thank you for Shane. I thank you for the study he puts in, Lord, and Lord, thank you for these guys that teach and study your word, Lord, that bring it to people like myself, Lord, that don't know it as well as we should, Lord. We thank you. Lord, thank you for the truth that's there. I thank you for being able to see it in our lives. Lord, please hide our selfishness. Please hide our